Welcome to the Architecture Association living room. And this is our fourth session of Field Forum. So Field Forum, here we really center the interconnectedness embedded in the built environment and trying to attuning our senses to material flows, planetary scales, intergenerational times, and all the lives entangled in these processes. So we've been having pair of conversations under the theme planetary everyday, matter in the field, senses and sense making. And in those sessions, we talk about the coming into being of things, talked about ice core media, seabed sands, and turning the ground, as well as land reclamation and resistance. And today, with the last session, we will have Dorothy and Lindsay telling the stories about the Littoral, about the dynamic zone between land and sea. On that, I'll give a bit of introduction to start from Lindsay. Sorry, just need to find my notes. Yes. So we have Lindsay here. She's Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange in the School of Architecture and Cities at the University of Westminster. I just want to say, personally for me, as I was on my own journey trying to learn how to think like climate, I came across Lindsay's work on this amazing 5-year endeavor on monsoon assemblages that just surfaces the intricate connection between land, sea, and air. And more importantly, is how they're iterative becoming of space-time mattering really challenges the Cartesian ideas about space, the linear idea about time, and then the human-centric ideas about agency. But we're more fortunate today that Lindsay will share with us the unpublished new work actually follows this incredible monsoonal journeys.
And I'd like to also warmly welcome Dorothy Tang. So she's a landscape architect and assistant professor in the Department of Architecture at the National University of Singapore. Her work is concerned with intersections of infrastructure and everyday life, especially in communities confronting large-scale environmental changes. So we met in Singapore earlier this year when we are on our journey of tracing sand. So while we follow sand as our material guide, we also follow the flow of water along the Mekong River basin in Southeast Asia. And Dorothy is a water expert. So her current research explores the histories of water, infrastructure and urbanization in East Asia, and the infrastructural landscape of foreign investments in Southeast Asia and Africa, also the geopolitics of transnational watershed management. So now I will pass the mic to Lindsay and Dorothy, and then Cyan and I will join for a conversation with everyone here. So welcome.
Will it work? Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm a little nervous about this. I've never spoken to an audience sitting on cushions and enjoying a drink, so let's see if I can hold your attention. Dorothy and I have structured this as a sort of two-way conversation. We've each got some short kind of patches that we're going to pass the mic between us, and we hope it's going to work as a sort of semi-planned conversation. Okay, before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to the stories that I will tell tonight. In particular, the activists of the Save Ennor Creek campaign in Chennai, and the fishers of the village of Katukupam and Mugatawarakupam in North Chennai, India, for these are their stories, not mine. Okay, let me see now. The littoral, meaning the seashore, let's just try and get this video moving. Sorry, let's do that again. There we go. Will it start playing? Maybe we need some tech help here, because it really does need to play. I hate this. There we go. Okay. The littoral, meaning seashore, is the shallow coastal zone shared by land and sea, fresh water and salt water, sand, silk, rock, mangroves, birds, fish, prawns, oysters, people, spirits, and gods. It changes shape dramatically with storms, floods, and tsunamis, but is also shaped by everyday changing winds, currents, waves, tides, and seasons, which interfere with and diffract one another, giving meaning to space and time. The rhythms of land-sea interactions are described by French anthropologist Jean-Claude Penrod as ressac, meaning surf or backwash, and by Barbadian poet Camus Braithwaite as tidalectic. Both terms invoking the continuous movement and rhythms of the ocean-land interface as a way of giving meaning to history. These dynamics produce what Indian environmental historian Debjani Bhattacharya called liquid land or fluid geography, a zone where landed and oceanic lives, economies, imaginaries, epistemologies, and cosmologies mix and merge in a fluid fluxscape. Held in common by land and sea, the littoral's boundaries are fluid and often difficult to define, and its material unruliness poses challenges to societies seeking to fix it through engineering and the law, and we're going to hear quite a lot about that from Dorothy. It eludes the fixity of capitalist property regimes and the assignment of objects and people to discrete and stable categories. Its fluidity and impermanence is registered in the idea of common property, porambok in Tamil, an in-between condition defined by sharing and community. The littoral forms a frontier zone that does not separate or enclose, but finds its meaning in its liminality, a word meaning an in-between, a threshold, or a transition between one thing and another. Hydrologists refer to the littoral as an interface between coastal saline regions and inland freshwater regions. And environmental historians have borrowed the term ecotone from natural scientists, meaning a zone where two distinct ecological zones mix, to understand the multiple ambiguous meanings that littorals register. Liminality is also associated with amphibiousness. Indian Ocean historian Michael Pearson identified littoral people and littoral creatures as amphibious, their lives moving between land and sea and disrupting land-sea binaries. He identified fishers as the quintessential littoral people. Such features of being neither one thing nor another, queer, are often treated as culturally problematic, even taboo, and viewed as sources of fear, risk, and danger to be avoided or repressed. It is hardly surprising that fishers are amongst the lowest castes in Indian society, and their villages are settlements apart. Framed by these ideas of the littoral, my presentation today is going to tell 4 stories from Ennore Creek, a once thriving littoral zone in North Chennai in Tamil Nadu in India. I will tell of its dismantling, by developmentalist narratives of uninterrupted power, economic growth, and globalization, and how the backwater fishers asserted their ways of knowing and being to resist the destruction of their life world. And I will conclude by drawing out some lessons for design from these littoral stories. Over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. So since Lindsay has essentially theorized it for us, I'll introduce my project a little bit. It's conceptually a little bit different. I'll be dealing with the littoral in a different way, primarily thinking about how modernization, or the project of modernity in Hong Kong, has constructed an infrastructural littoral that has expanded its uplands and expanded into the sea. This intersects with Hong Kong's territoriality, questions of sovereignty, its evolution during various periods throughout the colonial era, as well as the current post-colonial era, or some might say even internal colonization. We can have that conversation later. And in particular, this evolving relationship questions the islandness of Hong Kong as a territory, its autonomy and sovereignty, in relationship to this expanded littoral zone, which we will begin to conceptualize and understand in a little bit. So what I'm going to do in my talk today is that I'm going to move beyond the kind of ecological definition of littoral and the very rich ways in which Lindsay has described it already. And I'm going to talk about what it means in a legal sense. Oftentimes, for example, marine boundaries, and for example, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982 uses the bathymetry and islands and those locations as a way to define where territories meet, intersect, and different kinds of rights. I will further expand that to think about how infrastructures, especially in the case of Hong Kong, also begin to expand that notion of space. But before we get started, I wanted to give you a sense of the history of Hong Kong's boundaries. Many of you know this, that after the First Opium War in 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing, Hong Kong was ceded to the British. And at that time, it was just Hong Kong Island itself. And so this is one of the first maps that defines that particular territory by the British colonial government. In 1860, there was a second Opium War, and there was further, even more territory that was ceded to the British. And in this case, in the Convention of Beijing, you see that line, that dotted line in the Kowloon Peninsula, and that line is very important. It's currently called Boundary Street, and you notice that as part of that territory, there's also a small island that kind of floats. And that was important because that island, and Stonecutters Island, which will be featured throughout my talk today, essentially was one of the most important military barracks for the British, and is currently one of the military barracks for the People's Liberation Army of China. I'll talk more about that later. In 1898, there were further treaties, unequal treaties. And at this point, there was an extension of Hong Kong's territory, and it was a leasehold for the new territories. And this extension was very important because Hong Kong, as an island, even with the Kowloon Peninsula, didn't really have a hinterland. And so the idea of extending into the new territories was to create a hinterland for the self-enclosed territory, right? You need water, you need agriculture, you need all of these resources. And at that time, Hong Kong Island itself was more urbanized, and there were villages in the new territories that became very important in providing these resources for the burgeoning colony. So, that treaty was interesting. I don't know if you've noticed, but basically the boundaries of that treaty included the northern shore of what we now know as the Deep Bay and Emirs Bay, which is the border of Shenzhen in China. And at that time, when they drew that line, basically the border was very fluid. And so when they defined that edge as the shore, there was a debate over whether or not the foreshore, which is the space in between the low water level and the mean water level, who owned that space? Was it the British or was it the Chinese? And who had rights to that particular space? And so the British were a bit aggressive here. They were like, well, it's ours, of course, right? Because that is clearly our land. And so basically, they claimed that territory, but that territory also became very important after World War II, because even though those spaces looked like they were blank, but they were actually quite occupied. There were oyster farms, but it was also a space that migrants from China or refugees, these freedom swimmers would swim and float in the water for 8 hours in order to escape the Cultural Revolution and come to Hong Kong. And so that space, even though it was liminal, it was undefined, there were these outrageous claims about who owned and who could occupy it, was also a space of freedom and also a space of hope.
Right, okay, back to me. My first story is titled Coastal Zone Mismanagement. In 1991, the government of India issued its first coastal regulation zone notification to regulate development along India's coastline and to protect fragile ecosystems and the livelihoods of littoral people. This notification demarcated the littoral into 4 zones, CRZ 1 to 4, based on their fragility and the level of development present, and established rules as to what could and could not be built in each of them. But what has been shown over the years, far from protecting India's littoral, the CRZN notification, through exceptions, amendments, and revisions, has transformed it into a contested frontier of development and urbanization. This is actually a map of Mumbai, and it directly shows the conflict between a new highway, the line in blue, and the fishing villages, the dots in red, along that coastline. Under the 1991 notification, coastal states were required to draw up coastal zone management plans and maps for their jurisdictions. This is actually the 2011 CRZ map for Ennor Creek, the area that I'm going to be talking about. But to go back, in 1996, the Tamil Nadu government published a coastal zone management plan that included 30 maps. Map number 2 that we see on the screen covered Ennor Creek, the backwater of the Kossas-Thalaya River in North Chennai. The map is extraordinary, I think. It's sinuous and fuzzy. It's struggling to ground its line in the fluidity of the littoral. It designated the creek and its wetlands as ecologically sensitive, and all development within it was banned. The creek is this backwater, so it runs parallel with the coastline up the dimension of the map. Not a year later, the Tamil Nadu government issued another map and gave permission by a state agency to acquire land in 4 villages alongside the creek to establish what they called a petrochemical park. The land would be allocated for building a new port, now Kamaraja Port, exclusively for the handling of coal, and to projects at the behest of the Tamil Nadu Industrial Development Corporation. This new CZMP map incorporating this proposal, was sent to the Government of India for its approval. The map, unearthed by Chennai-based activists through the Right to Information Act in 2017, as you can see, erased the creek, the wetlands, and the tidal backwaters, and replaced them with a cartographic tabula rasa titled Petrochem Park Tidco Project. And what I've done here is I've sort of outlined with that red ellipse, that title, and the area allocated to the petrochemical park is outlined in blue. And then what I did, I just overlaid it over the 1996 map to show what it actually eradicated. While the petrochemical park never materialized as such, 10 years later, the government of Tamil Nadu began industrializing Ennore by stealth. It parceled out portions of the wetlands for a second port and shipbuilding yard, thermal power plants, and heavy industries. In 2017, the Kamaraja port began reclaiming a portion of the wetlands by dumping dredged ocean sediment into it. A sign read, "This land belongs to Kamaraja Port Limited. Trespassers will be prosecuted." This came to the attention of Ennore Creek's fishers, and in January 2018, they staged a massive mobilization of fishing boats and men, women, and children called a near Satragraham, which means a water truth-telling. They stood waist deep in water on the location identified for port expansion, declaring, "This is water, not land." And the slogan, "The river is our life," resounded at the event. This demonstration mobilized and celebrated the amphibiousness of the fishers' way of life and refuted the blindness of official narratives. It revealed indisputably that the land designated for the port expansion was in fact 4 feet of standing water, which no map or legal fiat could erase. Interestingly enough, this demonstration brought a halt to the expansion work in the wetlands, and in February this is an image of machinery having to remove all the spoil that had been deposited in the wetlands. And in 2021, in a case filed by a local fisherman, the National Green Tribunal ruled that the 1996 CZM map was the only approved map, and the fraudulent 1997 map had no legal status at all.
So in this next section, I'm going to talk about how the population growth after World War II shaped the landscape of Hong Kong through an iteration of making and remaking land. So what you see here is an image that you cannot find on the internet anymore. The government took it down. From 1996 that outlines all the land reclamation that occurred in about a century in Hong Kong. Just to give you a little bit of context, this is a timeline that shows Hong Kong's major water infrastructure development in relationship to population growth, as well as at the bottom, you see basically water rationing. So Hong Kong has always had a water shortage, and even though the colonial government kept building more and more infrastructure, they could never keep up with the population growth that happened after World War II, part of it due to the migrants and refugees that were crossing the border at a very, very high pace. Because the population growth was so rapid, the colonial government couldn't really deal with it. And so all over Hong Kong, you would see about 30% of the population lived in informal settlements, in squatter settlements. And so here in 1953, there was a major fire right before Christmas for Shakip Mei, which was a squatter settlement. And this prompted the colonial government, even though at that time territory and sovereignty of Hong Kong was unclear, to start a new public housing program. And this was radical for the colonial government because they had never thought they would stay in Hong Kong for that long. The sovereignty was quite uncertain, especially their relationship to China. So this public housing kind of program, which is quite radical, right now in Hong Kong, about 50% of its population live in public housing. And this is how Hong Kong dealt with the landscape. It's a very steep territory. For those of you that have been there, only 25% of that land is occupiable. Most of it is too steep. And so in this case for Wah Fu Estate, which was, I think, a 1960s project, my colleague Vinci Mack has been documenting how the terrain was reorganized in order to accommodate this large-scale public housing project. In this image, you see here another resettlement estate, also in the 1960s, in the Kowloon Peninsula, and you see how massive these developments are, and the ways that, I mean, the architects at that time had no imagination, so everything was terraced, everything had to be flat. I mean, now hopefully we know a little bit better, but that also created other sorts of problems like landslides, lots of flooding, and other kinds of issues. So in addition to remaking and terracing the hilly landscape, what we also see is massive land reclamation. Anything that is flat in Hong Kong is reclaimed. And so here, although this wasn't historical, this is reclamation work in the 1990s for the new airport, but you begin to see how the Littoral has expanded, has been displaced by this massive modernization as well as housing project. And so I'm going to end here with a quick animation of how this developmental kind of regime reshaped the shoreline of Hong Kong along Victoria Harbour. And so I just want to point out Stonecutters Island, which is on the left side of the image, just as a visual reminder of its importance later on in the presentation.
Thanks, Dorothy. You said 1996, and so did I. So at least we had something going on there between us. Okay, my next story, story number 2, is called Leaking Lines. Is this going to play? This is actually video. The violence of development inheres in the earth and pits the earth against itself. Its power is carried by earthly matter that seeps, leaches, flows, and drifts across terrains and into the bodies of those exposed to it, human and non-human alike. These forms of violence are slow and accretive and take advantage, by design or omission, of the malleability of the earth and the vulnerability of flesh to ecological change. From the 1970s onwards, the Ennor dunes and wetlands were designated as a hub of thermal power generation by the state of Tamil Nadu. The commissioning of the Ennor power station in 1975 was followed by the North Chennai thermal power station in 1996, the Vellore thermal power station in 2012, a second stage of the North Chennai power station in 2014, and today there are 3 more under construction. This has positioned Ennor as a node in an archipelago of coalfields, coal-fired power plants, and industrial ports that has transformed India's littoral into a fossil-fueled economic growth machine. In thermal power plants, coal is crushed to a fine powder and burned in vast quantities to heat water that produces steam under very high pressure. The steam drives turbines whose kinetic energy is transformed in a generator into electrical energy. The chemical processes that accompany the burning of coal also produce carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, and other heavy metals and particulates, which, when emitted into the atmosphere, condemn those living into it to a difficult, panting breath, apart from many other diseases. The toxins are also present in the ash residues of coal combustion: fly ash, a fine dust, and bottom ash, a coarse, angular ash particle, which at Ennor are pumped in a slurry through elevated metal pipes to an ash disposal pond, pond being a euphemism for a vast sea of toxic ash. But metal pipes are not firm and reliable in the face of the materiality and liveliness of the littoral. For salt, sand, brackish water, currents, tides, and flows all present challenges to metal, causing it to corrode, crack, leak, seep, collapse, or break down. This means that the toxic residues do not stay within their enclosed boundaries, and we'll see that in your work a bit later too. They enter the littoral life world, are caught up in its flows, and dispossess its webs and ways of life. When I was on a toxic tour of Eno in 2017, run by the Save Eno Creek campaign, I witnessed a fountain of toxic slurry bursting through a corroded pipe into the wetland below. 3 engineers were standing over it, figuring out, with not much urgency, how to stop it. The scene was an image of what Gabriele Hecht calls residual governance, a minimalist form of governance that uses negligence and neglect as core tactics, and treats people and places as waste and wasteland.
So I'm going to talk about a different kind of waste. And I'm going to talk about the importance of sanitation in the colonial city of Hong Kong as a form of civilization, as a form of separating different classes. I'm not going to go into the entire history of sanitation in Hong Kong. Others have done much better work than I have. But I just wanted to point out that up until about 1920, Hong Kong's sewage was still primarily night soil. So you poop, it goes into a bucket, and someone takes it away. It's a sort of dry form, which is much later than most, I think, European cities. And so the thing is that night soil had an economy. Most of the public toilets in Hong Kong until about 1920 were privately operated because night soil, especially urban night soil, was considered to be much more nutritious because urbanites, urban dwellers, supposedly had better diets. So what happened was these night soil collectors would then collect all this night soil and ship it on a boat from Stonecutters Island, remember that island, to the western part of the Pearl River. And that would then fuel a traditional form of mulberry dyke farming, where there was an interconnection between a pond where it would have like fish in it, and that nutrients would then be dredged and then put on a dike that then fertilized mulberry trees and was a very important part of the silk industry. Now, with all of this shit from Hong Kong, they ended up figuring out that in order to make a profit, they would fill up these ponds and actually create mulberry fields. And so this became a problem when Hong Kong started building mass housing and started using flushing toilets, because no longer was there night soil to collect, so that industry basically died. I mean, the silk industry in China also basically died down. It took a nosedive before the war, but this new form of dealing with sewage became a problem. It was no longer profitable. So by the time Hong Kong built all of this public housing, and this is one of the first resettlement estates in Shek Kip Mei right after that fire, you see that there's the toilet, the washing areas in these areas were communal. And it became a really important social space, as you can see here. But going architecturally, we begin to see these resettlement estates that were built specifically for the squatters displaced by the fire were organized around this H block. In the middle of the H block were the communal washing and toilet facilities. There was only one water point at that time, and so if you had to cook, you had to go to the water point in order to collect water. Piping, all the piping was basically centralized in that core It's a little bit different than how we think about building cores now. Of course, in the 1970s, they decided that was not a very sustainable way of living, and so they renovated some of these blocks and basically put new water points and toilets in each unit. You can see the configuration here. But at the same time, remember, Hong Kong had severe water shortage. It was only until 1982 that water rationing ended in Hong Kong. And so in order to deal with this massive problem, the Hong Kong government decided to pioneer a new kind of water system. So in 1958, they mandated that all new buildings would have a dual water system. One was for fresh water and one was for seawater that was used to flush toilets. This is one of the only places in the world that actually uses a dual water system, which meant double the amount of infrastructure. And so you see here for So Oak Housing Estate, which is also a public housing scheme, the Hong Kong colonial government decided to experiment with this new system. And so even though plans had been drawn up already, they quickly ordered the architects to quickly convert all the plumbing system to accommodate this new building code. So you see here this dual water system, which allowed for a relief in the freshwater provisions, also began to reorganize domestic life. In these newer public housing blocks that were only about 4 or 5 years after the original ones, you see that each unit has their own toilet. And this is kind of important because part of this project of sanitation and hygiene is basically moving the kind of washing and all of these different kind of chores into private spaces. It's no longer in a communal space, and that was very important for the Hong Kong government to start thinking about what next steps need to be taken, as well as what kind of social welfare systems were there. In this image, what you see in the elevation, I don't know if you can see from the large screen, is that there are 2 tanks on the rooftop. One is a freshwater tank and one is a saltwater tank. And this is still the case today. When I lived in Hong Kong, if your plumber messed up and connected the wrong pipes, which happened, I mean, there's a lot of stories about that, you would essentially have salt water in your tap, and you'd have to ask them to reconnect the plumbing. And so this is still something that is very material and part of everyday life in Hong Kong.
Thanks, Dorothy. Okay, I'm now going to tell a story about mud. I think we're working quite well together here. For the fishers of Enor, mud, or seru, their Tamil word for healthy river sediment, is life. They know it through their bodies, how it feels underfoot, its texture, colour, smell, and depth. The fishing happens by people getting into the water, so they feel the sediment on their feet and know what's in the sediment in terms of what they can catch. They know it through the different species it sustains: crabs, oysters, polychaetes, and prawns, and what they mean to their lives and livelihoods. If the creek sediments change, life changes. The sediment is deposited each year by the Kosasthalaia River, or it is carried in from the ocean by tides and settles slowly on the creek bed. As Enor industrialized and the infrastructure its infrastructure and toxic residues entered the littoral life world. The sediment and its life-giving properties changed. It was upturned and dug up. Construction debris, dredge spoil, and sewage sludge were dumped into it. Coal dust and coal ash settled and smothered it. Its mineral composition changed. Our research found that high levels of mercury and other toxic metals in sediment and the bodies of prawns, crabs, and mussels had made them change their lifestyle, had made them change completely. Tidal ebbs and flows were blocked, and traditional fishing grounds staked out in the creek were abandoned as fish, prawns, crabs, and oysters were poisoned or vanished. These are some images, number one, of a prawn kind of completely coated in oil, and on the right-hand side, or I don't know which side it is for you, of what is called ash prawns. The whitish prawn is a prawn that hasn't eaten. Prawns eat the kind of small organisms in the sediment, and so they were eating ash rather than anything else. Forced to live with the ongoing trauma of toxicity and infrastructural detritus, some fishes took up employment in the very industries that had dispossessed them of their fluid commons. Others resisted this, and in solidarity with the Save Enoch Creek campaign, developed artful, collaborative ways to stay with the trouble of caring for the creek's toxic sediments. Fishers became cartographers. This is a map they drew of their fishing grounds to have them officially recognized in the state's records. They threw the language of maps back at authorities and won a number of court battles to remove fly ash and dredged spoil. They engaged in citizen science, sampling and testing. They litigated, attended public hearings, organized toxic tours and food festivals, made music videos, wrote blogs, and mounted exhibitions. They invented an effective mode of what I call amphibious activism, becoming citizen scientists, cartographers and activists, plaintiffs and organizers, not in place of being fishers, but in order to resist the destruction of their commons and ways of life, so as to continue to be fishers. I love this image. It's of one of the fishermen leaders who was conducting some soil sampling for us and actually caught a fish in the other hand at the same time. So a very amphibious idea of what living on the creek was all about.
So this next section, I'm going to talk about the question of water quality. As mentioned before, Hong Kong in its building code started implementing this dual flushing or dual water supply system. But Hong Kong had already been building a lot of buildings. So the implementation of this dual system was quite opportunistic. It was extremely decentralized. And so here you see a map from 1957 that shows buildings that had this dual flushing system, or the dual water system. Some of them you see are larger estates, which are mostly new public housing estates, and others are individual buildings, and many of them were private, like the Peninsula Hotel, a very important colonial building, had its own pumping station for toilet flushing because it's a hotel and so it has a lot of toilets, but it also used salt water for its cooling systems. And so because water was very, very scarce. So here you see a contemporary map with the blue dots that are all of the different locations of seawater pumping stations in Hong Kong. The seawater pumping stations were very minimal. They didn't need to go through the entire water treatment process because it was for non-potable uses. And so all they needed to do was to screen out, basic sediment and so on and so forth, do very, very simple chlorine treatment, and then they could basically pump it to to a service reservoir that then went into the saltwater mains throughout the territory. But of course, there were some material changes as well. As you know, salt water doesn't really work well with metal. And so in this drawing of Sook, which is one of the first housing estates that I mentioned, they actually started using PVC pipes, and you can see that from these construction drawings. Now, for those of you that know anything about architectural history, you know that in the 60s and 70s, for a lot of new built buildings, we were still using copper pipes in the rest of the world. But in order to deal with this question of erosion, the erosive quality of saline water, Hong Kong had to innovate in its materials and fittings and so on and so forth. Of course, this has huge implications in many different ways. Not only did Housing Authority need to convert to PVC pipings and deal with different kinds of standards, but we also see other ways in which salt water begins to invade into the uplands of the city. In this case, this is just from 3 months ago. This was a water main burst, but it's a saltwater main burst. Saltwater mains tend to burst 3 times more than freshwater ones because of the corrosive nature of saline water. In fact, in Hong Kong, for saltwater mains, what they have done is that they actually line it with concrete inside a metal pipe in order to try to prevent some of these events from happening. So this created a problem because I mentioned before we have we pump from the harbor for flushing water, but yet we also discharge sewage into the harbor directly. And so this is a proposal for, at that time they were renovating Kai Tak Airport, which is the old airport in the center of the city. And you see here they have a proposed, on the bottom left, there's a proposed pumping station for cooling as well as flushing for the airport. However, what's not shown on this map is at the end of the runway, they also proposed a sewage discharge point. So you can begin to imagine, depending on how water flows, it would contaminate the source. And so, of course, this project was scrapped. However, this became a big issue. Because of the decentralized pumping stations as well as the decentralized sewage treatment facilities throughout Hong Kong, the water quality of the harbor became a big issue. This was complicated by land reclamation that changed the flow of currents and water at different seasons. And so many efforts were made to understand how to deal with flushing out all of this contamination that was accumulating in the sort of narrowing harbor through land reclamation.
Thanks, Dorothy. Okay, my final story is called Littoral Drift. The transmogrification of Ennore took on new dimensions when the Modi government launched its Sagamala program in 2015. Sagamala, meaning a garland linking the sea, was designed to transform India's 7,500-kilometer coastline into a logistical interface through port-led development. Sagamala was the maritime equivalent of 3 other of Modi's flagship programs: Make in India, the National Industrial Corridor Development Program, and Bharatmala Pariyana, which aimed to connect the country from end to end via expressway corridors, railway lines, and inland waterways, punctuated by new manufacturing smart city nodes and linked to coastal and oceanic routes. Together, this logistical formula aimed to provide the technological ecoskeleton of Modi's big push economic strategy to tie India into global economic circuits, what has otherwise been called logistical urbanism. As part of this initiative, the government of Tamil Nadu approved a deal by Adani Ports and Special Economic Zones Limited to acquire a port and shipbuilding yard that had been built in 2013 at Kattupalli, just north of Kamaraja Port. On this strange map I've got on the screen, the new port is kind of the one that's sort of brightest on the screen, and you can see it's adjacent to the coal delivery port. It's very close to it. Once the deal was approved, Adani immediately set about obtaining approval to expand the port 18-fold from an area of 136 hectares to a massive 2,472 hectares, of which 800 would be in the sea and 350 in the wetlands. That's a master plan of the new port that you're seeing on the screen. The use of hectares as the unit of measure of the proposed port's extent is conceptually significant. It translated the dynamic littoral volume into the fixed, measurable, two-dimensional units of property, and was to be held in place by 3 new breakwaters, totaling 12 kilometers in length. But the littoral drifts, a term describing the slow transportation of sediment along a beach by the swashing and backwashing, the ressac of waves at an angle to the shore. In southeast India, wave angles follow reversing monsoonal tides, winds, and currents. From March to October, they transport sediment northwards, and from November to February, southwards, with a net gain of sediment in a northerly direction. Obstructions to these flows, such as breakwaters, result in sediment build-up against the southern side of the obstruction. And, due to interrupted sediment supply, erosions to its north. This is a photograph of Chennai's iconic Marina Beach, which is not a natural beach at all. It's an accumulation of littoral sediments built up against the southern breakwater of the Chennai port since the mid-19th century. The authors of the environmental impact assessment for the Adani port modeled the impact its breakwaters would have on littoral drift for 1, 5, 10, and 15 years after construction. Models predicted shoreline erosion of the order of 240 meters after 15 years. So the EIA proposed a groin field to counter the erosion, but acknowledged that this measure would only push erosion further north, where, according to the Stop Adani Save Pulicat campaign, the narrow Katupulli barrier island would be breached. So there's this very narrow island, it's only kind of a couple of, about 50 meters wide, would be breached by the erosion of soil, forcing the evacuation of fishing villages, causing Pulicat Lake to the north to kind of merge with the Bay of Bengal, and drawing areas deep into the hinterland, into the littoral zone. These projections were revealing, in that the Katupalli fishers knew that despite what the EIA said, that when the littoral is engineered in place in one place, it adjusts and reforms itself in another, through the ongoing, untamable continuity of the dynamics of littoral drift.
Now we're going to turn our gaze to Stonecutters Island, which I promised many times before, which is identified in this orange dot. I just want to point out that even though it was originally an island, as you can see here, now it has been reclaimed and is no longer a littoral island. In this section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk, in the last section I talked about the upwards expansion of the littoral through seawater flushing and saltwater mains, and in this section I'm going to talk about how it expands into the deep ocean in the other direction. So Stonecutters Island right now is the location of the world's most land-efficient primary sewage treatment plant in the world. In a very small space of 10 hectares, it treats half of Hong Kong's sewage. How is this accomplished? It is accomplished through a plan, I'm going to just go back a little bit here, that you see, which is the strategic sewage disposal system that was proposed in 1989, was never fully implemented, and I'll explain why. And the idea was to collect sewage, centralize it in Stonecutters Island, which is ironic because that was also where night soil used to go and was shipped out to the rest of the delta. And then it would outfall in south of Llama Island, which is also part of the territory, in a deep ocean outfall. So Stonecutters Island not only was the largest sewage treatment plant in Hong Kong, but it also was a very important military space. In order to understand the outfalls and their environmental impact, the Hong Kong government also went through a series of environmental impact assessments, looking at wastewater treatment options, combining various ways of primary and secondary treatment. We can go into a lot of those details later. It's kind of insane. But one thing that is very important to note is that, remember, the sewage is saline, which meant that the chemical process and the physical process of treating the sewage in its primary treatment required a different kind of system. It's not the same as the rest of the world. It requires a very expensive chemical treatment in order for the solids to drop out to become sludge, and then that's shipped off and treated in different places. As a result of that, Hong Kong decided that it would invest primarily in primary treatment. And so you see here the scheme, which basically connects these different sewage collection systems throughout the different districts. They put them in these deep pipes, these giant tunnels under the territory, underneath the harbor. And then it goes to Stonecutters Island. It's then, at this time, it was proposed to reclaim another island called Green Island for secondary treatment. And then it went to an outfall. As you can see, it branched out into the waters beyond Llama Island. So you see a section here of what that dispersal system might look like. But here's the problem. It was extremely controversial because they forgot they had a neighbor called China. And so in this case, it's kind of interesting because the original plan was proposed in 1989 after we knew, after the Sino-British declaration, that determined that Hong Kong, after its 99-year lease, would return the entire, the British would return the entire territory, including Hong Kong and Kowloon, as well as the new territories, to China. And so I don't know exactly what happened. I haven't been able to interview anyone because it's very controversial. But my guess is that the British were like, you know what? You're going to be one country at some point, so who cares where the outfall is? They planned it after they knew that Hong Kong was returning to China. But China was angry. And so in this case, sorry, I'll just go back. And so in this case, you see the boundary of Hong Kong drawn and where the outfall is proposed, which is beyond its international boundaries. It also is part of where a current takes this sewage and drifts it to another part of China in Zhongshan, which at that time was applying to be a tourist destination and required a certain kind of water quality. So neighbors were very angry. As a result of this, the plan was scrapped. While Stonecutters Island wastewater treatment plant was still built, but it no longer had this deep oceanic outfall that went beyond its littoral boundaries. At the end of the day, what happened was that there was also a conversation about who should pay for this infrastructure. And in this case, similar to how sanitation and hygiene shifted from a collective kind of space to individualized household spaces, in this case, the Hong Kong government or the colonial government decided that people, residents, domestic users of the sewage treatment facility should be responsible to fund that particular infrastructure because they were the main polluters of Victoria Harbour. And so while there were negotiations back and forth, and ultimately due to protests and other kinds of controversies, they decided to only charge for operational costs, and not the kind of infrastructural capital costs, but this still was a huge endeavour for the British colonial government.
Thanks, Dorothy. Okay, I'm actually going to conclude my section now, and then Dorothy will have the last word. And if I was struggling to think how I'm going to conclude this today, for if I was talking to social scientists, which I often do, I would draw out lessons from the fisher's struggle as a sort of practice of a Foucauldian practice of liberty. However, to this audience, who I presume are mostly designers, I'm not sure are particularly interested in the fisher's struggle. So instead, what I'm going to draw out lessons, I'm going to try to draw out lessons from the littoral itself as a trope or a metaphor for spatial and design practice. how might the littoral provide a model for design? And I've got 3 ideas here, and this really is quite tentative. First of all, as these maps showed, and what interests me about this map this time is the fact that it reduces the littoral to those 2 yellow lines, okay? Because that is the zone you can't build in. But the littoral cannot be reduced to a line. For lines are what we as architects and designers work with all the time. But what this story shows us is that lines simplify and erase. Okay, these 2 lines drawn on the map simplified the littoral, and to a large extent it erased it. So what do our lines erase? I think that's the question the littoral teaches us here. And the littoral also disrupts those lines. It doesn't work in lines, but rather in gradients and flows. So what might modes of practice look like that disrupt the lines around our disciplines and our practice? So I'm interested in the littoral as a kind of trope for the disruption of the disciplinary lines that we draw around our practice. The second thing I'm interested in is the littoral as the overcoming of binaries: land, sea, nature, culture, hydro-social, science, affect, etc. This image is of a plan that my colleagues in Chennai drew up, which was a pluriversal planning document for Enor Creek to counter the official plan for the eco-restoration of the creek. And in this plan, kind of ghosts, monsters, and dreams are as present as the lines of the eco-restoration plan that was drawn. So how to build non-binary thinking and non-binary practice into design? How to create space for radically different ways of being and knowing to coexist within design practice? And finally, to note that the littoral has its own agency that does not only impede or block the will and design of humans, and we've seen that in both of our talks today, I think, but it has its own trajectories, propensities, and tendencies, and is a mode of design in itself. So how then does the Earth's agency factor into our thinking about design? Thanks, and I'm going to stop there.
So I'm going to conclude in a different way, and we're going to talk about mud, going back to one of Lindsay's themes. This is a map showing marine fill resources, mud disposal areas, and reclamations in Hong Kong from the 1960s. What you see here is how marine resources, what's happening in the water, in this expanded littoral zone, becomes a resource and becomes infrastructural for the city itself. But there's more than just infrastructural functions. While we are building, expanding, and reforming, reshaping the land, reshaping the littoral, engineering the littoral, it also becomes a space for other beings. In this case, the Chinese white dolphin, which is an endangered species in the Pearl River estuary, they're very sensitive to sedimentation in water and sort of and the kind of, I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, like when you disturb the mud. Turbulence, right? And so they're very sensitive to water quality. And because of the land reclamation due to the Hong Kong airport, as you can see here, they were quite threatened. Many environmental groups, including WWF, as well as other local environmental groups, protested. And ironically, even though they're endangered and were a symbol of development, the white dolphin became Hong Kong's mascot during the 1997 handover ceremony, which is kind of ironic. But it begins to highlight the conflict between development, thinking about the littoral and the beings that live in the littoral, as well as the material transformation of the engineered littoral in Hong Kong, as well as its boundaries. In this case, I would argue that the boundaries, the moving, shifting international boundary between British Hong Kong to the, currently Hong Kong as a special administrative district region in relationship to the rest of Greater China becomes infrastructural as well, because that dictates what can happen and what cannot happen within the littoral zone. In this case, material flows and globalization, as well as what these spaces what can happen in these spaces become very important. Hong Kong used to be one of the largest shipping hubs in the world. Now it's overtaken by Shenzhen. But because of its natural deep waters, which is why the British wanted to build a colony there anyway, we see that the sedimentation in the harbor due to land reclamation and others have started to endanger its role as one of the largest shipping hubs in the world. Dredging operations in the Hong Kong port is critical to its survival, to be competitive in this sort of global economy. But yet we begin to see that when we begin to think of regional ecologies and economies, we can start to imagine this littoral zone as expanding towards other regions. And so this is a map of the Pearl River Delta with Hong Kong sort of in the center. And the different kind of shipping facilities and infrastructures that are crucial to it. I mentioned the export of night soil to the Pearl River Delta, which is on the west side of the delta, which is where the silk region used to be. Now that is where most industries are starting to move towards. It used to be on the east side of the delta, and industries are starting to move west. As a result of that, shipping is still the most efficient way of getting goods from the western part of the delta out to America, to here, anywhere in the world. And Shenzhen and Hong Kong are the major international ports in which this happens. So while Hong Kong is dredging to remain competitive, disposing its mud within its so-called border, there's also dredging and material transformations on the western side of the delta as different local river ports are dredging in order to also be able to ship their goods out. So the material flows has sort of shifted, and yet the boundaries, these international boundaries, symbols of sovereignty, also are blocking the movement of this material. So I'm not going to have profound sort of conclusions the way that Lindsay did, but I just wanted to suggest that perhaps thinking through the littoral, and I realize I have a typo here, would help us understand sort of larger flows of material, people, goods, and economies, and perhaps that has some implications for the practices that we engage in. Thank you.
Wow, thank you both so much. That was kind of our dream to set up this kind of conversational presentation format. I think we'll do perhaps just one question and then give to the floor. I guess both of you really showed us. So what I have, like the couple of keywords I had in my mind at the moment is actually like discharging, digesting, like digesting as in like literally the body digests, and it's also like the sewage system, like the whole territory digesting, and also the housing through the dual or the pipes and the pipe bursting, and also Lindsay, in your case, you mentioned the heavy metal, the fly ash. It's like the cold thermal plant digests, and then it goes into the air, goes into the water, and then goes into other critters, and goes into our own body. So all of this, it really messes up all the kind of scale, or kind of scalar understanding we had in our knowledge system. And so my question is actually more on the method end, like what are the tools, research tools, design of tools that you have or you have to invent in order to register this kind of messiness of scale, messiness of human, non-human, and all that.
Can I say something? It's not going to answer your question. It's not going to answer your question directly. But I just found the way you spoke about this new technologized ocean in these pipes under the city, you know, and then the kind of city moving out in the form of other pipes into the ocean. There's this extraordinary kind of image that comes to mind. In that story about the salt water moving up and over and down and out again. I don't know, it was just an observation I have. But you know, in terms of methods of doing this research, you have to jump between scales all the time. There's no such thing as kind of nesting of scales. It's like the microscopic is kind of as significant as the map you've ended up with, which is the sort of global connections. And one has to develop a way of thinking between scales and drawing between scales. And it's not easy. Yeah.
That's interesting because earlier in our conversation, we were talking about collaborating with social scientists, historians, real historians, not fake ones like us, and sort of other, you know, engineers and so on. And one of the things I realized is that in their practices, mapping is always a fixed entity. It's about data. It's not necessarily a process of discovery. I mean, there's data and then you analyze it to answer a question. But I think as designers and in this context, what we're able to do is to use mapping as a way to ask a new set of questions. And because we're not fixated with the precision, we were talking about this earlier, we're not fixated with precision, and so we, in some ways, entertaining alternative forms of knowledge becomes really important. Then your mapping is able to move beyond nested scales of zooming in and zooming out. But for example, in this map, the idea was to juxtapose all of these different scales together as an experiment to start thinking about what are the interconnections between all of these different scales and how can we begin to tell a story about that.
Any questions from the floor? Or we can keep going? Please. I think I'll just give that to you.
Okay, so thank you very much for this fascinating presentations. I think that maybe it's interesting because you split it to two sides, but sometimes I feel that you guys aren't in the same line of when you're presenting, okay? Because here I feel that it's a little bit dystopian about modernity, and here it's a little bit critical about modernity. But maybe this makes it easier for me to just split it into two questions, one for this part of the presentation and one for that part. For me, I think the interesting of this presentation is that it reminded me with the idea of the crisis of garbage in the United States in the 1950s, and the idea of how this sparks the idea of urban commons. Okay, who owns the garbage, who manages the garbage, and it becomes as an idea of infrastructure. So if I'm seeing that also the sewage and the water in Hong Kong as a way from perspective of infrastructure and perspective of urban geography, as a way to rethink urban commons, but from a different perspective, from perspective of Hong Kong, because it's different politics, different economy. And maybe use that critical approach to get to results about what we mean of urban commons beyond the Western-centric understanding for it. So this is the part of the question for this. And for this presentation, I think that also what I found that interesting is that you're making it problematic, the relationship between the modernity and the environment. But sometimes there are cases that are not very progressive. For example, there are cases like, for example, informal settlements in, let's say, South Brazil and South America and Vietnam, where people are a little bit kicked out from the city because of the neoliberal things, okay, and they occupy the beds of the rivers, for example, okay, so they end up after in 50 to 30 years, they don't have any sewage systems, okay, so they are being now died because of the expansion of diseases, okay, but in the same time, if we want to fix these things, we had to gentrification them, okay, and this would be a political problem. It's the same question for example, refugee camps who are built on the beaches. Like, for example, in Gaza now, people are just kicked out towards the beaches, okay? And there's a whole of a refugee camp who is built over the beach, okay? It's not about going beyond the idea of dystopian of modernity, but those people need houses immediately. They don't have a sewage systems. They can't have a sewage systems. After 15 to 30 years, they are now being died. In a critical point, they are being died because of the diseases. But if they wanted to change these things, they had to just go out of their homes, which will be, or make it more permanent, which is a political problem. So the idea becomes more problematic than, okay, the traditional classics of the right to the city, people who have those labels and who just, okay, protest over the modernity or over the plants, the factories, all these things. Thank you.
I'll go first. That's a really interesting question. One thing I didn't really dwell on is this notion that sanitation in the British colonial government's eyes was about personal responsibility. And I think this is very common in colonial governance, is that questions of sanitation, it's very important because you don't want the plague, and there was a lot of public health issues in Hong Kong in the early part of the 20th century. But the colonial government essentially pushed the responsibility to individual households to incentivize different landlords in order to deal with sanitation. They privatized public toilets, for example. It was a completely private entity. And so your question is interesting because I'm not sure if Hong Kong is that different from other parts of the colonized, part of the empire, because all of those regulations and activities were really during British colonial rule. And I think what ties it, so Hong Kong is known as one of the most liberal economies in the world, free trade, all that kind of stuff, it's really fun. But what is interesting is that I think the colonial government had to make a decision about what was for the public good and what they could privatize. And so maybe the question is not what is the urban commons in this case, but what the government decided would be suitable for people to take on responsibility on their own and what they had to provide. So for example, in this book project that I'm writing about, that I'm working on, the colonial government in the 1960s decided that providing water and sanitation was a government responsibility. Transportation was not. So Hong Kong built one of the first completely privately funded tunnels under Victoria Harbour. It was the largest at that time. I know we're used to build, operate, transfer projects and kind of private infrastructure now. But at that time in the 1960s and 1970s, it was really a pioneer in thinking about private financing as a critical part of funding infrastructure. So in this scenario, and simultaneously, they were building some of the largest freshwater reservoirs in the world. That were extremely expensive, and they decided that would be public money. So I think, to me, going back to sewage, thinking about trash and waste and sewage treatment, what I didn't mention is that Victoria Harbour in 1996, because of all the land reclamation, was protected under a new law as a new kind of common space for all of Hong Kong. And so there was no more land reclamation allowed. There was a mandate to keep the water relatively clean. You can swim in it now, I think. But then at the same time, the government shifted from thinking of sanitation and sewage as something that related to the government, and now they're pushing the cost onto private citizens. And so the polluters pay principle, which is normally used for industries, right, as a kind of remediation or reparative measure, was now interpreted as a way for citizens to take responsibility for harming the environment. So I'm just going to leave it there. It's open to interpretation, but I mean, we can have a longer conversation about that.
If I could say, I mean, I liked your point that this is actually a very binary setup here, and we're sitting in the liminal zone in the middle, which is worth thinking about. I don't really know how to answer your question. I mean, I don't really know what the question was. It was some interesting comments. But, I mean, what I've tried to show in my presentation, that, the sort of, in the modernization of India, has done some great things for India. I'm not denying that. But there are these sacrificial zones which actually the government doesn't care about. And it's usually where the lowest costs of people live. So that's really the story I've been trying to tell, and the refusal of these fishers to give up, and the small incremental gains they've made to just maintain their way of life. They don't want to develop. When these power stations first came to the area, they were offered jobs in them, but they were earning more from their fishing than they were going to get paid as contract workers. So, in fact, they would have been poorer had they kind of become workers in the industries. So really, that's the story I'm trying to tell, that let's look at what's erased, kind of when the benefits of modernization and electrification do not benefit everyone equally.
Hello. Thank you so much for the inspiring talk from you two. As a Hong Konger, I really resonate with what Dorothy you have been mentioning. I think some of these stories, they are oral histories that come from my grandparents, especially for they traveled from the mainland, they swam all the way down to Hong Kong. And I find it interesting because the idea of threshold boundaries, they play such a strong narrative that would harm, I think, in my opinion, the governmentality of the government. And I find that to be the idea of boundaries, they play such a strong overarching theme towards how government itself, they have their own national or colonial narrative to build upon a stronger nation or stronger region. And I'm really fascinated by the idea of how, especially for Hong Kongers, where people really pride on their infrastructures. So basically the city as an engineered city, they pride a lot on being efficient, being fast and productive in all of the senses. And I'm really wondering, with all of these adverse effects, especially when we see the case in India, what is the breaking point of all of this national narrative? I'm very interested as individual designers, or we should say designers of the new age. How do we confront this, for a more exaggerated way to say it, the brutality of this national narrative? I always feel like there is a very strong political helplessness when I consider as what we can do. So I look forward to your insights.
Where does it break? We were just talking about disruptions in the tube today, and how in Singapore, where I live, one of the MRT lines was derailed, and it stopped like service was disrupted for 4 days. It made headlines and it was terrible. So it's kind of interesting to think about notions of disruption and what the breaking points are and how the kind of national narrative is disrupted. I'm going to answer that in an oblique way and start to think of protest and spaces of contestation in Hong Kong, which have become infrastructural. The very spaces that the colonial government and the Hong Kong SAR government built with a lot of pride, and we were talking about how in the 1980s when the MTR in Hong Kong, which is the underground system, was first built, it was open to fanfare. People were flocking to it. It was very celebratory. The MTR operators would always boast about how if the train was 30 seconds late, then like the entire system would have to go through some vital check. But these sites were also the sites of protest in 2019. The airport that we saw earlier that caused that endangered white dolphins, I was trying to fly to China and I literally was delayed by 12 hours because that was taken over by protesters. Infrastructure spaces, the highways were also spaces where they were occupied, and also the MTR stations, the very picture of efficiency, those were also sites of protest. In fact, what was really interesting in terms of spaces that were of refuge were private malls during 2019. So here, I think we have a much more complicated relationship between what is public-private, what the tipping point is, and what all of these different infrastructural engineered spaces mean to communities that are living within them, and how they're occupied and how they're deployed in various ways.
And look, if what I could answer, I mean, I think it's a really important point you've brought up about the national narratives that are sustaining these projects. And I mean, in our work in Chennai, and I think it's increasingly the case in India, any opposition to an infrastructural project is couched in anti-nationalist terms by the government and by the courts. Okay, so you're not just kind of wanting to protect your wetland from toxification, you're actually being counter-nationalistic. You're countering the national narrative. So it's a very powerful thing at the moment. And I guess with Trump coming in, it's becoming more ubiquitous, you know, these nationalist narratives that any opposition to the state is seen to defy. The organization that I worked with on this project, towards the end of the project, and I don't think the project was to blame for it, had its license to receive foreign funding withdrawn, and so it can no longer operate. So I mean, it's insidious actually at the moment. Yeah. And when does it break? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't break in one go, little bits. You have to chip away at it, I think.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a fantastic question. If I may add to that, I think it's kind of linked to, I think it's kind of the designer has a specific set of tools and eyes to identify the material form of that narrative. Because when the national narrative at its strongest is when it cannot be pinned down. It's just like an idea and ideal in your mind. That's when it's really, really powerful. I think what both presentations showed is to identify, to pin it down into the pipe, the leaking pipe, and then into the sewage system and into the tap that you have. So I think this is where designer's knowledge or architectural knowledge really, really is powerful and can work in concert with, say, the fishermen and the activism you just mentioned. So yeah, I just want to add that. Thanks. And I think there's a question.
Thank you very much both for the fantastic talk. So I think what was really interesting in both your talks was these three characters that have formed the character of the state, the character of the local people, but also the literal as its own sort of character and its agency. So with these characters in mind, my question is, how do we balance between the governance, but also the ungovernance of the literal?
Good question, and I wanted to ask Dorothy a similar question. The story of this kind of engineered literal and the hubris of it and the kind of idea that it can't fail. It's like, what disrupts it? Does the literal ever feature other than as an engineered literal in Hong Kong? Or is it just really contained and pinned down?
Well, in this particular talk, I was trying to talk about a highly engineered and constructed literals so that we could expand the liminality that you were talking about. We can begin to expand the kind of environmental implications of it. I don't think I did a very good job of expanding that. But in Hong Kong, there's I think I mentioned there was like oyster beds in the Deep Bay. So the literal, there are other forms of literal, and where the state and local people and these other creatures intersect, I don't know if there is a balance.
No, I don't think there's balance anywhere.
There's never a balance, right? And I mean, what I really like about what Lindsay was explaining was that the very tools that were used to govern were also tools of protest and resistance. Right, and I know that counter mapping and these types of practices are not new. We've been studying it for decades now, but I think it becomes a really important kind of counterpoint to the way that we think about governance. Is like, who has autonomy, who is utilizing the tools, whether it's the tools of the master or not. In some ways, it kind of doesn't matter unless it becomes subverted again. So I think that what the literal gives us is this ability to perhaps be more flexible about how we think about governance, or how we think about autonomy, and how we think about freedom to a certain degree.
Yes, indeed. I mean, what that term I used, the sort of amphibiousness of the fishers' struggle, was not just because they live their lives half in land and half in water, but because they're not afraid to use the instruments of the state, the law courts, mapping, as part of their struggle. So there's no binary opposition. It's not us versus the state. It's, hey, let's use the instruments of the state when it gets us somewhere. So there's a very kind of nimble, a kind of way of kind of negotiating this very powerful state apparatus that they're living within. But we must remember that the literal isn't very kind of human-centric, in the sense that it can also be very inhuman and do tremendous amounts of damage. So the literal is not a romantic idea. It's a space of fear and apprehension and uncertainty increasingly. Yeah.
I'll just add something to that. So, for example, in the pumping stations, one of the problems with not chlorinating enough in saline water, salt water, seawater, is that there's a lot of creatures that accrete in the pipes. So it's not just a matter of erosion and so on, but there are these other creatures that, I mean, you see them on ships, you see them on piles, that grow inside the pipes, basically block the intake of seawater and for flushing. So there's all sorts of kind of interactions that, again, kind of defy that binary, I guess.
Maybe I think on this point of define the binary, I think today you define the binary setup of this of this dual screen, and I think on that, I know there are still questions there. We might continue the question in an informal way. I believe we still have drinks back there, so that's the best infrastructure we have for conversations. And I just want to thank everyone again for coming. I know out of the infrastructure disruption we're having today in London, so thank you all for coming here and for your time. And I know this is the last session of Field Forum. I've seen some of you coming for all our sessions, so thank you again for the attention. That's very much appreciated. Thank you very much.